Tonight's speaker is Vecchio, with his topic, the telegraph, the weather and the Goyder line. As we set up this evening's meeting, I've heard some comments from Jen and seen some of his slides, and it's certainly a topic of which he is quite passionate and which he's put considerable amount of time and effort into. It will involve, in particular, those very well-known South Australians, Sir Charles Todd and George W. Goyder. I'm not saying more about the topic because that's Jen's job, but just a little bit about Jen. He graduated from Adelaide University in applied physics and completed a course in meteorology in Melbourne. He worked as a meteorologist at the Australian Bureau of Meteorology for some 34 years. Early in his career, Jen completed further studies in oceanography at Flinders University, modelling the effects of swell and high seas generated by winter storms across Australia's southern coastlines. And his surge model of 1976 is still used by the operational forecasters for the prediction of abnormally high tides associated with storms and calculation of potential flood levels for low-lying coastal areas. His other interests include travel, classical studies and medieval history. He's semi-retired, but like all retired people, he's busier than the rest of us. So, Jen, please come forward.
Thank you for your wonderful introduction, and good evening everyone. I hope you enjoyed tonight's talk. It's one of my passions. When I retired, not so long ago now, I felt that something had to be said about Sir Charles Todd and the government of South Australia, because South Australia is a different case. And I was lucky to get off shift work in the last year of my career. And I was doing some climate research, and I came across all of Todd's papers, among other things. And I thought I'd better write it down because nobody knew anything about it. But operational forecasters didn't want to know. They were too busy, and most scientists really don't care much about history. In the words of Ford, all history is classical. I think he calls it something like that. He said. Anyway, I thought as my country present was to write something about South Australia and how it came about to the Bureau of Meteorology came in, almost 100 years ago to this day. Sir Charles Todd and all the colonial, by that time, the states came in Adelaide, and they claimed what the new Bureau of Meteorology should be like. And next year, the Bureau of Meteorology will be 100 years old, and I'm hoping to present to the Eastern State colleagues with the papers so showing that Sir Charles Todd ought to be the father of Australian meteorology. The title tonight is The Telegraph, the Weather and the Goyder line. The telegraph is really the key to weather forecasting, because if you think about it, prior to the telegraph, there was no way that we could communicate in a quick way what was happening in a broad scale. We hear that Adelaide gets Perth's weather in 2 days' time. But how is somebody in Perth going to tell us that it's raining there and to wait for that rain to come before the telegraph? So, just think about it. And nowadays, of course, we have so much information that can come in from all sorts of data. But in the times that of the South Australian colony, there was absolutely no way that information would be passed along the quickest way would have been by horse or by sheep. And to make a successful forecast, we don't rely so much on Mr. Smith having a romantic meeting or hands building up a nest with ready for the flight. We need information in a very quick way. You can actually see from this picture up there that in order to make a successful forecast, that's the area that you need to do it. So that in the space of 5 days, to make a 5 days forecast, you need to virtually walk throughout the world. Consequently, the telegraph is important because until the discovery of the telegraph by Morse back in 1844, scientific weather prediction was just not feasible. And who used the telegraph? The first to use was the British Rails and the police, mainly to signal pickpockets more than anything else on trains. And so they say, oh, we've got pickpockets in such and such, will you stop it at this Lincoln and see if you can catch so and so. Later, the stock exchange realised very quickly, oh, this is wonderful, we can monitor what the price of wheat is doing in New York, and we'll pass it along. And then, about 1852, the Royal Observatory, not so long ago when you think about started sending the telegraph signal for universal time. Prior to that, everybody was using local time. So the local time in London at midday is not quite the same as Liverpool, or again different in Glasgow and other parts of the United Kingdom. So about 1852 they started using that. And about that time there was a war, a terrible war, the Crimean War, and lots of shipping was lost, and everybody thought, well, if we have some warning of these, we will probably save some life and property. And the idea was put together that perhaps there should be a weather bureau sponsored by the government. And Admiral Fitzroy in the United Kingdom started forecasting weather, and at the same time Murray in the United States did the same thing, and they relied heavily on the telegraphic imports. From the telegraph reports, they would draw charts, analyse the charts and make prognosis, basically what we do today. And about that time in 1854, the South Australian government, and mind you, South Australia was at the time was less than 20 years old, and the South Australian government asked the Royal Astronomer, in fact in London, for a telegrapher and astronomer, and Sir Charles Todd was chosen. Now, Sir Charles Todd was not Sir George Airy first choice, but his second choice. The reason for that is that Todd came from a fairly poor background and he never graduated as such, but that never held him back. And he was well tutored by George Airy himself, and by the time he came to South Australia, he was extremely confident. He was about 29 at the time. His wife was 12 years younger and about 3 inches taller than him, but you know, it's the man inside that anyway, my story is largely going to combine wheat growing and also meteorology, because I take part in this land. And South Australia is fortunate that we have very good weather records before the telegraph, and they were held together at what is now the Postmaster General, but before then it was the Surveyors Department that did most of the work. And because South Australia was an agricultural state more than anything else, I should really call it an agricultural colony, climate and the knowledge of climate played a major role, so much so that as early as 1842, a climate in South Australia was put together by no other than Kingston himself, Kingston House, not far from Brighton and Seagrove, if you go down. That was his property. And he put together a climate in South Australia mainly to sell to people, because people were interested in knowing what the climate in South Australia was like. You've got to remember that people were coming from another part of the world, and we knew very little what climate was in South Australia, what the rainfall pattern was like. Therefore, the South Australian story is that briefly, the South Australia, as you know, was founded by 3 settlers who bought land at a fair price, and the profit from land sales subsidised future in the ocean, otherwise known as the Vecchio plan. Now, the Vecchio plan itself was an interesting and novel way of colonising. I don't know anything against Vecchio, and I think he's brilliant, except that he had a predilection for 15-year-old girls. The South Australian economy, therefore, was based largely on the successful mass production and global distribution of wheat and also mining. But mining was volatile, as it still is today, whereas wheat was steady, and it was the steady income that made South Australia great for the years. And from about 1860s onwards, South Australia, with its ports and trains and the telegraph network, was servicing these industries, and it really was a cutting edge in technology at the time. In fact, this is the success story of South Australia, because in comparison to the rest of the world, we were highly sophisticated in that way. And of course, all agricultural activities, and agriculture in particular, are affected by the weather. The weather knows no boundaries. You can draw political boundaries, the weather just ignores them. And provision of weather services, of course, to farmers and manorists is an integral part of the South Australian story. And the fact that weather played such a big role on the economy of the nation was such that even at the time of federation back in 1901, when they elected a new Prime Minister of Australia, the office of the Commonwealth Meteorologist was right next door to that of the Prime Minister, mainly because he went, oh, what's going to say? That's what's happening around the country, more than anything else. The graph of South Australia itself, very briefly, I should have been South Australians and not a bit about it. The city itself was founded in 1937, and 5 years later, agriculture was already flourishing, and the proceeds of wheat already had overtaken and became South Australia first, South Australian main export commodity. Of course, it had already overtaken the first industry. The first industry, of course, was whaling. So only in the space of 5 years. And more importantly, which is often not realised, that the opening of the Northern Adelaide Plains made the cost of bread in New South Wales cheaper, because New South Wales and Australia largely were dependent on the importation of wheat. And prior to the opening of the North Adelaide Plains, the wheat would have come from South Africa or from Argentina or other parts of the world, even England. And the repeal of both the Corn Laws of 1846 and the Navigation Act of 1849 opened South Australia to the rest of the world. And of course, the profits from the South Australian exports, which was mainly based on the broadacre production of wheat, fostered steady immigration to South Australia. In 1856, during the Crimean War, the South Australian population, which the state itself was only 20 years old, had reached 100,000, and South Australia was granted responsible government. The population grew even further in the next 10 years to 185,000 plus, and reached almost 300,000 by 1881. By comparison, the Adelaide population in the 1880s was about 40,000, or around 60,000 within 16 kilometres or 10 miles of the GPO. And we have a quote there from Ray, a fairly well-known meteorologist. Many are Germans, or people living in Adelaide, Chinese are also numerous. Who are the South Australian icons before the advent of the telegraph? Obviously, we have Matthew Flinders. He's very prominent not only in South Australia but Australia wide. Colonel William Light did a lot of reports in his journals. Unfortunately, his journals burned in 1939, in January 1939, and we've lost some of the records, but we still have some journals. And of course, George Strickland Kingston, that I spoke before, he had a son that became the Premier of South Australia about the time of Federation. He died aged about 58, of course, but that's never been that. Since the advent of the telegraph, the most important people there obviously is Charles Todd, later known as Charles Todd. He was just Charles Todd at first. George Goyder is important as well because he was a surveyor general, and he virtually said which area of South Australia ought to be settled and are useful for agriculture, which are suitable only for grazing and opening up the area of South Australia that is pastoral. And Clement Grey is the third one in there. Okay, Goyder himself, he was born in Liverpool, and he was a draftsman when he came to Australia. He was only about 22. He went to Sydney at first. 3 years later, he's in Adelaide, where he married an Adelaide girl, Frances Smith, and he probably all have relations. So if you have, put your hands up. And Goyder himself was a small man, according to Coles and Weaver, who has written a little about him. He was a small man with red hair and a pallid complexion. In 1853, he was appointed to the Colonial Engineer's Office, and he moved fairly rapidly up the ranks, so much so that by 1861 he was promoted Surveyor General. In 1865, there was a terrible drought, and the state government was under a lot of pressure in sort of relieving farmers claiming for compensation and claiming for assistance. So they sent Goyder out there and said, well, look, assess and come up with something so that we know which land is suitable is not sustainable. And to Goyder's credit, he did these in only 5 weeks. Now, what other pattern nowadays can come up with? And it's quite remarkable. You know, I'm waiting for a conversation from Metza, from the storms back in August, and they told me they've just lost the checkbook. And Goyder was able to do all these in 5 weeks. Another thing that he actually did was that he surveyed many towns in the mid-north and the Northern Territory. Places like Goyder, Clare, Blythe and Gladstone are fairly well known in South Australia, and many others. Other springs, of course, Dan Creek, Darwin, Bay Waters, to name just a few. When his wife Frances died in 1870, she left him with 9 children. 18 months later, he married Frances' sister Ellen and had an additional son and 2 daughters. I am told some of his children were students at this college. And I look forward to seeing that because I think it will be quite an interesting thing to see. He was chairman of the board for railways. He had a lot to say about railways, where they ought to go. And wherever the railways went, the telegraph went as well. Of course, you can actually see what was happening in South Australia. Some towns rose and developed, particularly on account of the railways, and those that were too far away from the railways, they just perished. And Goyder had a fair bit of say that Todd, of course, would have been very close by because wherever the railways went, so went the telegraph, and so went the post office. And whatever the post office was, there was the weather bureau as well, because they were reporting rainfall, the temperatures, and reporting back to the observatory in Adelaide. When George Goyder retired back in 1893, he moved to Milo, and leading citizens around Adelaide all come together and put together 1,000 sovereigns. So how much is a sovereign? I think it's 5 shillings. No? It's not big. It would have been disturbing, isn't it? I can't even, I wasn't quite sure how much it is. I put a sovereign was 5 shillings because I found okay. So it would have been a pound. Okay. Substantial amount of money in those days. Substantial. Okay. Well, Goyder, and I have acknowledged this, I got it from the Norfolk Library, this one. It's a caricature of Goyder about the year 1865. You may recall that this was the year of the drought, and this is the year that Goyder had been told to go out there and find an area that was the area that was affected by rainfall and the others that was not. So this is one of the caricatures that we found at the time. Goyder, after 5 months, after only 5 weeks of looking, he came up with a line, and the line comes directly from government reports that we brought back, and you can actually see the line reasonably well. I don't have a point with me, but you can actually see the line moving through that way there and up north and then to the south. And on the other side is also a continuing line. The line is very close to the, what I would have said, a 10-inch to 12-inch rainfall line, or to 250 millimetres to 300 millimetres. And the idea for that is, the reason for that is that South Australia enjoys a Mediterranean climate, which means that most of our rainfall happens in winter. And this is the period that wheat grows in South Australia. So during that growth period, you need about 300 millimetres to have a successful harvest. And all Mediterranean countries will have a similar one, but not so much in areas like Italy that come to mind, because the rainfall there is very high. But certain parts of Spain, you're already starting to look for these areas. And certainly in North Africa, in places like Tripolitania and Cyrenaica and even Tunisia and Algeria. And also in the Middle East, in parts like the Fertile Crescent, which is the area that our civilization in Mesopotamia came up and we had inherited. So the 300 millimetres is not South Australia. And of course, wherever wheat was grown, we had new settlements that took place. These pictures showing the settlements that took place between 1869 and 1874, and of course the railways are shown there as well. And by the 1860s, we find the train has come in and the bullock teams have been replaced. And what you can see, this is one of the technologies that South Australia is very good for. This next line shows further lines that were proposed by Goyder, where line rainfall is still fairly good. You can actually see that in north, the railways are moving towards Augusta, and further on will move on towards the lower plains. What happened is that about 1870s, there was lots of pressure put on the government to do away with Goyder land, mainly because the population had increased, all the good, useful land had been taken up, and there was this push north into the more remote areas, and Goyder was very much against that. So much pressure was put on the government, that the government eventually caved in, because after all, the cost of supplying wheat to the rest of the world was increasing, because wheat was a major commodity. Like everyone nowadays watches the ABC at 7:30 and look at the price of oil. Well, the price of wheat was the main commodity at the time. And they said, well, we got all this land, we should be going further north, because it so happened that about that time we had about 10 years when rainfall was above normal in South Australia. And they had started planting crops north of Augusta, and they did reap something for a while. And the German settlers, they came from obviously northern Europe. Their experience in Ukraine was that wherever they went, and the rain would follow the cloud, and they come up with that theory as well. And certainly this is the case of the 1870s, where if you look at this rainfall pattern, you can actually see that even further north, the rain patterns will be forming at the right time of year for the production of wheat. Included in that is the Northern Territory, because at these times South Australia was administering the Northern Territory as well as South Australia. However, a few years later, the pattern becomes fairly normal. This is much closer to the pattern that we see nowadays. You can almost see that on the pattern, the rainfall pattern for the 300 millimetre pattern. So consequently, if you are growing wheat north of that line, it is extremely marginal, and lots of people lost everything that they had. And Goyder happened to be the chairman of the forestry board at the time, and he was in opposition to Mr. Brown, who was the CEO at the time. And the two came to virtually blows. And Goyder said, well, I told you not to push that far north, but the forestry man said, well, you've got it. The problem is that we haven't got enough trees up there, and this is why there's cause for uncertain rainfall in the area. Of course, that's not quite right. Okay, we talked a little bit about Sir Charles Todd. As I said to you, he was an assistant before coming to South Australia. An assistant to the Southern Government astronomer at Greenwich, where Todd worked in what is called the galvanic department. The galvanic department is obviously another word for what would you call it, electric department, or the electronics department nowadays. He was at that time in charge of the telegraph, and the telegraph would have been used to send out messages when midday was recorded at GMT and transmitted throughout the UK. He arrived in South Australia in November of 1855. And the journey took 6 months, and his wife Alice was with him, and she had a nurse with her. And Todd also brought in an assistant, Cracknell. And the Crimean War was on, and one of the reasons why the South Australian government wanted a telegraph is because they were worried about Russian aid coming in and taking over their colony. So the idea was, when the Russian and a message is sent back to Adelaide Premier. And so that was money, and the reason why they wanted to let the telegraph up. Sir Charles was a visionary. He saw a pattern used rather than just military. And he thought, right, these are farmers. If I can collect data from all of South Australia, I can have a database to base my climate data and tell where people ought to be settling, and also give warnings to impending bad weather. And although he was a telegrapher, he was also a government astronomer. And as government astronomer, he was responsible for fixing the state boundaries. And in 1970, he was also made Postmaster General. And he was really, when he became Postmaster General, the meteorology took off because he had suddenly so many post offices in South Australia, and he instructed everyone, right, you will go out there at 9 o'clock in the morning and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and you will take temperatures, and you will take humidity and barometer readings and everything that you observe, and you will telegraph them to me. And that's really when meteorologists started at big scale. And as soon as he did that, he would do the analysis, and he would post them in front of the post office. The registrar will bring him, and the advertiser will bring him at 9 o'clock at night. This is what it's tomorrow forecast. He didn't always have it right, but he did the service. In fact, it's a classical case that he was found on one day in the middle of King William Street. Suddenly there was a heavy downpour unforecast, and he took shelter somewhere. And alongside him was a gentleman with an umbrella. And Todd says to him, "Mate, you're very wise, but you got an umbrella." And I says, "It's very simple." And no realised it was Todd. He says, "Oh, it's very simple, old chap. Whenever the weather looks uncertain, I read the newspapers, and if that chap Todd says it's going to be fine, I take the umbrella." So, Sir Charles Todd, he fixed the state boundaries, the cat standard time, and the time ball in Somerville was his idea, and the time ball, of course, operated from about 1875 to about 1931. In 1931, the time ball was replaced with time signaling. And Todd also was not only standardising South Australian time, but this time he was gaining status in the eastern states, because after all we built that great telegraph line that goes from Adelaide all the way to Darwin, and that's really what made him not only Australia famous, but world famous. And so he had a lot of ego, and he did all these in a very clever way. There was lots of things that Todd liked. He liked cricket. In fact, he was an honorary member of the South Australian Cricket Board, and if you go in the Adelaide Oval, you'll still see his name up there on the board. But, as honorary member, he liked horse racing. Oak Bank started back in 1876. And in the 1870s, he got caught with this great push to the north and buying land. He thought, well, I should buy some land north of the Goyder line, because after all, this is the way of the future, land of the gentry. So he really didn't understand the rainfall pattern in South Australia himself, so he bought land in the Goyder Ranges of all places, and that was quite a mistake, because he had many children and just one son, and a mortgage that he was bound to keep for many years after 60, when he probably would already retire. He retired when he was about 80. But apart from this things, Charles Todd promoted science and technology in a very good way. He was a member of the Adelaide University and also founded the Astronomical Society for South Australia. And because he was extremely popular in Australia, he was sent in 1985 to the Berlin International Telegraphic Conference. And his daughter Lizzie actually is their middle name. Elizabeth is a middle name, so the first name is Carlotta. And she came along. She was about 29 years old at the time. And in those days, unlike today, Carlotta or Lizzie would have been in today's very much a vibrant young lady. that Sir Charles Todd in 1905 chaired here in Adelaide the National Meteorological Conference. That was the blueprint for the future Bureau of Meteorology. That in the year, in about 1 year's time, will make 100 years of existence. He believed in the suffragette movement, and he was a founder of the South Australian Astronomical Society. He had interest in the electric strip lights here in Adelaide, trams, the telephone, radio, and of course good company. However, he did not believe that Orroroo served the post office. You know why? Because he loved making puns. One of his puns was this one chap, and he went to Todd, and there were a lot of meetings like this one. And there was one chap from Orroroo that kept on saying to him, when are you going to get the post office in Orroroo? He kept ignoring him. And one day he got cornered and he said, well, why when are you going to give us the post office? He said, no, because Orroroo will only allow you 2 letters. And he made a lot of things like that, and drove a lot of people insane. He used to say if he was a teetotaler and he believed in tea, and he said, if I don't have my tea, I will be odd. Little puns like that. And another time he said, why does he love astronomy so much? He said, because my mother at a very early age introduced me to the Milky Way. But anyway, just very briefly, just looking at what Todd did for South Australia, and this is done graphically. Before he came, we only had one place named Adelaide that had some observations. By the time Todd comes, the network is already starting to increase. And look what happens next. 10 years after 1860, 1869, these are all rainfall stations or met stations. By 1870, 79, they're pushing towards the Northern Territory border. Even more so, we have places in the 1880s played and spun off as farina, because after all, this is where wheat is going to be growing. Has anybody been to farina? Yeah, you know all about it. Wonderful place. And of course, the railways will have to go up there, and railways are very expensive and never very profitable. Poor old Goyder kept on saying, you know, how is this colony going to make any profits? And everybody says, well, you know, you've got to keep the price down for us, we're farmers. And nobody wanted to pay more than they had to. I'm surprised that Australia became bankrupt in the process of the railways. And look at it again, growing more and more. So by 1919, you can actually see what is happening. It's following the East-West Railway, and it's following towards the Nevada. Of course, they're the big line. They had to go all the way to Darwin. Of course, you're going to get Expo Springs, and only recently we completed the rest of the line. But Todd did other things as well. Of course, weather forecasting was part of it, and he would try really hard to forecast for storm surges, and particularly storm surges that on Port Adelaide in 11th May 1865, I saw his forecasts. They were pretty good, but of course, it got badly flooded. And this map that you see here is hand-drawn by Todd himself. Again, with the low formed south of Kangaroo Island. There was a storm surge at Port Adelaide and Port Pirie got flooded. There's Port Augusta and lots of places to the south of Adelaide and Port Along got flooded. There was heavy rainfall in this period, and it really was not a very bad time. And when the rain stopped, the wind came, and the wind caused even more problems. Now, this is a newspaper cuttings, and they are very interesting when you go through this journal, because you get to know who's who in the Australian meteorology. And the forecast you can see here is from Sydney, from Henry Russell. Henry Russell was the first Australian-born meteorologist, and the Eastern States, they're always trying to push him as the father of Australian meteorology. In actual fact, I think it's Todd, just that they haven't heard of that Todd. And it's my business to let them know that such a person existed, and we should make Todd prominent in South Australia, because after all, Henry Russell believed highly in Todd, and in fact he saw Todd as a father figure. And Robert Hillary is the Victorian, I can't see Russell, it's obviously there, there's Russell there, and I think Hillary is forecast for Victoria. And Hillary was the meteorologist in Melbourne, and Sir Charles Todd, of course, was for South Australia. So his forecast for this particular day, you can just about read it. It's going for unsettled, squally and showery, with strong west to southwest winds, fresh southwesterly gales, and light seas on south coast east of Spencer Gulf. Nothing that you can just about read anything there. No, that was very good. A little bit more about Todd, as I said, was a visionary. That's a picture of him just about the time he came to South Australia. Alice, his wife, was on arrival, 5 months pregnant with Lizzie, and he was the one that sort of said to the South Australian government, you know, I know you've employed me as an astronomer, and I know you've employed me as a telegrapher, I know something that before you publish the available these, I'm going to work forecasting for you. And I think that's quite amazing. This picture here was taken in Rope River in 1872. The telegraph line just was in the process of being completed, but they had a problem in the section from Tennant Creek to Darwin. He's surly looking young fellow. But I should be very careful what I say, because I will be your relations. He was totally competent, and that's, you can actually see that he didn't quite finish this section. He was the third person to try to finish that section, and he got very despondent in the end because the weather was absolutely awful. But nobody, you know, they realised yet how terrible the weather in Northern Territory could be. And Todd came up with the novel idea of taking this huge boat up the Roper River, which had never been done before in Save the Day, because he went across then to Daily Waters, and from there they managed somehow to finish the rest. Of course, it was a great success for him. And he was fully accredited with it back in 1872. He wasn't made a surgeon, but he was acknowledged for his great contribution and given 400 pounds of bonds. So what they look like in the 1880s, you can see that the postmaster, the general post office has been completed here, and of course Todd was responsible for this being done. And you all recognise this area, don't you? In the Hundred Gardens. Port Adelaide, very easy port in the 1880s. The Adelaide Hills and the vineyards, the mid-north of South Australia, wheat again, the transport, and shipping, more, I think this is Port Pirie, and trains, of course. And in South Australia they had three gauges, the broad gauge, 5'3", the standard gauge, and the narrow gauge. The standard gauge is what we use nowadays. And Unadilla was the further north of the train reached back in 1893. Todd himself, with some of his friends, Selecting from Arthur, and a few others. And just briefly about the Adelaide Observatory. When I started work, this is the place where I worked, not far from where Light had his shed that was burned down back in 1839. And the observatory itself was torn down about 1949, and it was a beautiful blue stone building, and it was also the residence of the astronomers, and South Australia, two astronomers generals. Todd was the first for over 50 years, and Goyder was the other one. And this is just a picture along the west coast at the time. The time is about 1875. The top family in the background is what we've taken at the observatory, the gardens at the back, what they call the paddock. This gentleman here is a well-known South Australian. He's William Bragg, professor of physics at the Adelaide University. Now, these are some of the pictures that of the meteorological data we collected. There's a still the screen there, and there's a image saying that there was a great debate in the 1880s as to how accurate the temperatures should be recorded, and Bragg pushed the instruments and screen, which is on the side there. Of course, the radio itself was invented by Marconi, and he was the first to send a message all the way from Gerald in Italy to Sydney. But soon afterwards, South Australia got to the outbound, Edward knew something, and Todd had his antenna, along with his son-in-law, Professor Greg, and they sent, using this wireless, the first message in Australia. And the message went all the way to West Beach, where we had our great fleet, the namely battleship, the Protector. And they sort of said, yeah, we got your message. So South Australia fought first, another South Australia first. And when Federation came, all the meteorologists got together and they sort of said, we have to have a specific Commonwealth Bureau. None of this separate colonies stuff. In fact, the Australian meteorologists created the Federation. And they had meetings, that they had standards of how the weather ought to be observed, how the forecast ought to be made, and how they ought to be disseminated. And they all agreed that that's how it ought to be done. So there was one person that did not go along, his name was Greg, and that Peter Adamson went further about. Peter, you get I think I saw you. Yes, that is part of the problem. You can actually see, he says, right, this is protocol, and they all agree, but Greg said, oh, I can do not only Queensland, but I can anywhere else in Australia. Of course, this was upsetting everybody. And you know who Zoo through that? Todd, very prominent, Russell, Ellery, we talked before him, and there's an Italian chap who became the next minister on foreign, Dr. Barocchi. He took over as astronomer general, or surveyor, astronomer general in Victoria in 1995. Family Road, of course, was from Queensland. And William Cook, now William Cook, if you go to the South Australian border, there's a station called Cook, almost on a border. It's named after this guy. This guy is from Adelaide. And on recommendation of Todd, he became the first astronomer for Western Australia. That's why it's named, that place is called, named after him. And basically these people come up, and there was a conference back in 1905 in Adelaide, of which Charles Todd, now almost 80, he was the chairman. And the first Commonwealth meteorologist he goes by his middle name, and better known as Ambrose Hunt, but his first name is Henry Hunt. And Ray wanted to be the first Commonwealth meteorologist, but and he said he put an application in, but he was Hunt that was successful. And we have a picture by Todd, very briefly. In this picture, is sort of in this letter here, we see that Todd writes to Mr. Hunt and sort of saying, look, there's a great South Australian, his name is Griffith, and I think you should make him your assistant. And this is what happened. All good back in New Zealand, 1907. And just a few pictures of the Adelaide Observatory back in 1947. This is the office that I started working in. Probably a lot of you will remember it. It was a very cramped, very small place. And this picture is the old observatory shame, a terrible shame. They tell people now because the Adelaide High School came in and the immigration started in 1952. And the old building that I started, the food went down back in 1978. However, the West Terrace has one of the longest continuous observations, not only in Australia, but in the world. In fact, temperature goes back to 123 years, from 1857 to 1979. And I think rainfall is even, yes, this rainfall is even longer, from 1839 to 1978. So it's one of the world's longest records. And nothing is left there nowadays. There's only a little stone that sort of says, yeah, the Weather Bureau is here. And what's left is that if you go inside the Adelaide High School, you will find a marker there that names the two South Australian astronomers, namely Sir Charles Todd and also George F. Dodwell. Dodwell died in 1963, and Dodwell also wrote a wonderful paper about South Australian earthquakes. Sure.
We have questions of you. Well,
There was a medal on the chest.
Yes.
That was Todd.
Yes.
Can you tell us what that was?
Yeah. I probably don't. I don't think anybody figured out. And that's not his motto. He got that medal for finishing the. He got that medal for finishing the Adelaide to Darwin telegraph line. So that is not his motto. His motto came about the 1890s. Came in St. George or something, I'm not quite sure, other places are, but that's not his motto. They live in just a day and Australia Day and recommendation. But he did get a bonus. Incidentally, Todd was responsible for planning the whole of the telegraph line from Adelaide all the way to Darwin. It was a position from Queensland at the time because they also put in a submission to the powers that they had to do it cheaper. And Todd government approval. Managers outside the time the governments came and went. It was a very unstable period. But a little bit like the governments of Italy after the war, in World War II, because South Australia from the period of 1850 to 1870, there were as many governments in as many years. And the government of Hart, which Hart Street in Somerville, fell mainly because the line was costing so much money. And good old Alice was really worried because the estimate went about 4 times what Todd had planned. However, it was a godsend thing because when Federation came, none of the post offices around Australia were profitable except South Australia. South Australia was making money. And largely because Todd was not only an excellent administrator, but also one that sort of you wanted to work for, and everybody pulled together and had a wonderful relationship with him. He was known as a great, a benevolent and protector of people. So that medal, in returning to that medal, is not his major medal.
I think I might know a little bit about that. On the main staircase here at the photograph Headmaster Chapel, it was here from 1876 to 1915. He was a companion in the Order of St. Michael and St. George, which didn't carry the cert. That would come later as KCMG.
Yes, that's right.
If you follow your minister, the CMG is calling you on. KCMG was finally calling you on.
I am essentially still a meteorologist, and things like this are not very important because you can always get something.
Any other questions? Glenn up the back.
Was there a connection with John McDowell Stewart's maps for the overground photograph?
Yes, very much so. In fact, it was based on Stewart's reports on the land in Northern Victoria. Todd would have used his sketches and his plans in pushing the mine north, and it was based on their report. It was decided to break the old land in 3 sectors. Todd took the section roughly from Northern Flinders to Cannon Creek, going through the McDonald Ranges, whereas the section south of Flinders was given to private firms around Australia. I think it was a South Australian firm that got there, and likewise the section from Cannon Creek to Darwin was also contracted out, and this is Patterson ended up getting the job, but Patterson was about third of the tank. Yeah, so the answer is Stewart played a major role in it, yeah.
Sorry.
2 comments or a question. The telegraph line was sort of a psychological line for the explorers up there. Giles, for instance, once he got back to the telegraph line, considered that he was home and hosed, even though he's still a week away from Adelaide. I went to Adelaide Boys High School in 1953, and the ruin of the old observatory was still there. And it was the first time I got to play with Mercury, because it was just all over the place.
I'm done with the caricature again. Because it says something more than I'm able to explain. That's exactly how he did it. It was a newspaper. And he virtually did it on his own. And then one day he says, I was looking for rain. In actual fact, he's really looking at the lay of the land, and he's actually thinking about prevailing winds. And he's looking where the vegetation is surviving and where it is not. And because it's just not a line that he drew, it very carefully thought about it. He says, right, it's in the winter time, it's the growing season time, the winds are coming from the west. Now, this rainfall pattern will come this way, and this is why Goyder one goes up the Flinders Ranges instead of south, because he knew by his own observation, because of the prevailing winds, orography will play a role, and therefore there should be a little bit more rainfall in those hilly country, and he pushed that line a little bit further north. Likewise, when he got to the Mariannes, suddenly he realised that Mount Lofty Ranges, with the westerly impinging on it, that area would be in the lead of that, therefore the rainfall should decrease. That was a very clever thing for him to do, and that I think is quite remarkable. By and large, what Goyder did is look at the terrain, at the soils, but he also put meteorology in the sense that he was looking at the prevailing winds, and I thought it was a very brilliant thing for him to do. The interesting thing is that we have now about 150 years of rainfall records, and Goyder line is still relevant, and it still shows that the prediction he made so long ago is still valid. But thank you for that question. But look, I have a question here. Can I answer you a little bit, because I've written about the Adelaide Observatory, and I had a seismograph there too, and I'd be interested in about what you said about Mercury, so I'll probably see what happens.
Could you roll the pictures to the early observatory, not the one on West Area, before that, and tell us where they were?
Sure. One thing of getting old is that your eyesight goes. So just excuse me. By the way, a lot of this stuff is on the web. If you access if you access the Weather Bureau's website, it's in there. It's under South Australia. So are you talking, sir, about what I'll do? I'll push this one first, and then I'll show you what it's all about. Basically, Adelaide High School is in this area here. The old observatory is in the site, and the Weather Bureau that you're probably thinking about when I started working was right on the corner of Glover Avenue and Terrace. This is the one. This one was in West Terrace, and this was demolished. You can actually see the picture. They demolished. This is being demolished in the late 1940s because they had to make way and for the Adelaide High School, which shifted from Sturt Street to West Terrace. And it's a shame because it was a lovely building and they perhaps ought to have retained it in some ways. But it's so much so that the architecture of the 1940s and 50s and even 60s, we went for modern things. And you can actually see this building here was part of the old observatory. And in the car park area, which I'm now not familiar with, okay, I know. Because what's happened, the Adelaide High School called me in about a couple of years ago because they discovered a huge stone in their car park. Because this building held the old seismograph. And they demolished these and made a car park. And the seismograph has been recently, not the seismograph, but the seismograph stand has recently been found. And I was able to sort of say, oh, that's what it is. And so the main building would have been right in front here, the one that you just see in the motion. Whereas the building that I worked was built about 1940, and it was in this area here. The building I'm talking about is this one here. And this building was built about 1979 was also demolished. And of course the Weather Bureau nowadays is just across the road. You can actually see it. It's in Kent Town. Okay? Answer your question? Thank you. Thank you.
Jane, what you were talking about, I backed out and went into the front office here at the school and checked out the details of the 3 Goyders we had in our file. And it makes quite interesting reading. There were 3 boys and they were all enrolled in April of 1878. It's quite interesting though, because 2 of them were born in 1864, only a fortnight apart. And I'm sure it's not even Goyder was so organised. So I suspect one may have been a nephew or somebody from the family that Goyder was a guardian for. So take these home and read them. And one of the boys was certainly quite bright and matriculated in 1880 and receiving the Order Scholarship in 1881. So there we are, something for you to take home. Thank you. I think then when you were working before you retired, you were in a very fortunate position of working in a game which was also a very great interest to you. And to have your hobby as you work is a wonderful thing. Your enthusiasm and your knowledge certainly came out. So thank you for profiling for us tonight the outstanding contribution of the 2 great South Australians during what was a vibrant, exciting, busy stage for the state, building railway lines and all sorts of things. You can't seem to build trams or hold airports these days. So we perhaps need somebody with a little bit of vision and